specializing in Indian foreign policy. On this new Brookings podcast, we'll be turning the spotlight on India's partnerships, its rivalries, and its role on the global stage. On today's episode, I want to take you back to a notable exchange that took place in August 2022 at the Indian Foreign Ministry's weekly press conference in New Delhi. Three journalists, one Indian, one Chinese, and one Taiwanese, asked the spokesperson about India's position on tensions in the Taiwan Strait following an increase in Chinese military activity after U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi had visited Taiwan. India called for quote, the exercise of restraint, avoidance of unilateral actions to change the status quo, de-escalation of tensions, and efforts to maintain peace and stability in the region, unquote. It also talked about being displeased about the militarization of the Taiwan Strait. This answer from the spokesperson was notable because India has in recent years largely stayed silent on questions around the Taiwan Strait. It was also notable because when the Chinese journalist and subsequently the Chinese ambassador to India pressed the Indian government to also endorse a one China policy, Delhi refused to do so, noting that its position was well known. Like Taiwan, India has also been careful about how it deals with and talks about the issue of Tibet. Indeed, Tibet has been of even more direct concern to India than Taiwan. We'll talk about why on the podcast today, though we won't go into the historical detail that we usually do. For that, I would recommend recent books by former Indian Foreign Secretary Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Professor Berenice Guillot-Richard, and Dr. Kyle Gardner. Today, we will look at how India sees issues and approaches issues such as Tibet and Taiwan. New Delhi knows these are sovereignty concerns for China. Over the last decade and a half, and particularly since 2020, India has been less deferential to Beijing on these subjects, but nonetheless, it remains conscious of Beijing's sensitivities. On today's episode, we will look at how India looks at issues such as Tibet and Taiwan. New Delhi knows these are sovereignty concerns for China. Over the last decade and a half, and especially since 2020, India has been less deferential to Beijing on these subjects, but nonetheless, it remains conscious of Beijing's sensitivities about them. And this consciousness includes being aware of past Chinese anger and accusations about India-US interaction on these subjects. To reflect this aspect, these issues fitting within a US-India-China triangle, today we're going to do something different. I'm going to be in conversation with my Brookings colleague, Senior Fellow Ryan Haas, who leads our China Center and holds our Taiwan chair. We'll exchange views on how India and the US see the issues of Tibet and Taiwan, and whether and how the other country fits into Delhi and Washington's pictures. Before I continue on to the interview, I want to thank you all for listening to or watching the podcast, providing feedback, and sending me questions on social media. I want to highlight that the last episode of the season of the podcast will be a special Q&A episode in which I will answer audience questions about India-China relations. So please do send us any questions you'd like answered or that you wished had been answered during the course of the season. You can do so by posting your question on Twitter or X with the hashtag GlobalIndia, all one word. Or if you'd prefer to submit your questions via email, you can send it to globalindia@brookings.edu. And now onto the conversation with Ryan Haas. Welcome to the podcast, Ryan.
Thank you, Tanvi. It's really a pleasure to be with you on Global India.
Ryan, I want to start from a broader vantage point. And as somebody who's been both a practitioner as well as a scholar and analyst of U.S. relations with China, in those kind of discussions, has India featured in those ties or in those talks between the two countries? And if so, how and why have India featured?
Well, I think that they have featured at an increasing level. And the real headline of my response to your question is that the degree to which India has figured into American overall strategy towards China has only grown from administration to administration. And if you just sort of briefly take it one administration at a time, I think the George W. Bush administration, they deserve credit for pushing forward the Civ nuclear deal that really helped unlock a lot of potential in the U.S.-India relationship. But I think that they viewed India as something that would have windfall benefits for America's overall strategy, less so as a component of America's approach to China. If you look forward to the Obama administration, again, President Obama invested considerably in deepening the U.S.-India relationship. And I think that largely out of sight, there was a deepening discussion that took place. Part of that was a feature of the fact that Jaishankar, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, was the Indian ambassador to China and developed a very robust channel with his counterpart at the time, John Huntsman, who was the U.S. ambassador to China at the time. And then after that, he came to Washington, was the Indian ambassador to the United States, and carried forward those conversations as well during that period. But there was also a deepening architecture of communication, different channels that were open and established, in intelligence and military channels, diplomatic channels, to really sort of move forward the discussion on China. And then from there, you move into the Trump administration. President Trump himself, I think, was tactical and transactional. But his team thought a lot about China and put a lot of energy into deepening the discussion between the United States and India as it related to China. And they put in place, mechanisms to share information and intelligence that have continued to serve a purpose of deepening integration of effort between the United States and India with respect to China. And then in the Biden administration, they are well known for being prominent advocates of the important central role of India in just about everything. Kurt Campbell is famous as saying that the India-U.S. relationship will be the most consequential relationship for the United States in the world in the 21st century. And they've invested considerable energy, both at the leader level and also below, to ensure that the gaps are as small as possible in how each side views, interprets, and responds to events relating to China. But that's sort of the overall arc. I think that there is a open and unresolved question in the expert community about how much potential still exists to push the ball forward. And I think part of that will, be a function of how India relates to China going forward. And on that, how are you looking at, how India is considering sovereignty issues that relate to China, whether it be Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, or Taiwan?
Ryan, you're right. It is a question that comes up quite a bit when I hear in Washington discussions about kind of U.S. and India working together. What is India's position on Taiwan in particular? But there is a broader range. Before I get to that, I do want to say one thing about, your point about the then ambassadors Huntsman and Jaishankar meeting. It tells you how much U.S.-India, discussions about China and the Indo-Pacific have changed, that when news leaked that the two of them used to engage in Beijing, there was kind of a lot of concern in India about such engagement. And today in such consultation saying, it'll upset Beijing. Today, such conversations are so routine that if a report came out that now Ambassador Pradeep Rawat and Ambassador Nick Burns engaged, there'd be kind of, a kind of collective shrug. It wouldn't even get noticed. But just going back to kind of your question, I think, one of the reasons for those sensitivities and cautions is because of India's kind of general sensitivities in how it has approach these sovereignty questions that China defines. And I think India has broadly seen these kind of 3 or 4 issues, Tibet, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, from 3 kind of prisms, or 3 perspectives that kind of combine for this kind of broader view that India has taken. I think one has been traditionally from the perspective of India's own sovereignty concerns factor into how it thinks about or approaches China's sovereignty concerns. Particularly for India as a post-colonial country that has been trying to consolidate its own borders, that has disputed boundaries, competing claims with two of its largest neighbors. If not, you can add even kind of there was the competing claims with Bangladesh for a bit. But basically, you've seen that a country like India has therefore tended to be, like China, sovereignty hawk, sensitive about others commenting on its internal affairs, or these issues which India considers internal affairs being brought up in international fora. So on that, it's actually been quite similar to where China has taken such position. I think the second prism through which kind of India has seen these sovereignty issues that China outlines is from the perspective of the India-China relationship, wanting to keep that relatively stable so that, despite all the frictions that they've had, so that India can kind of focus on growth and development and on its other kind of security challenges. And so there's been this tendency to not want to kind of do things that would kind of provoke China in some ways. And these kind of issues are seen as, if India takes a certain kind of, especially very public or changing views, as provocative. And the third thing is combining these two elements of India being a sovereignty hawk, but also concerned about India-China relations, is this aspect of Delhi's kind of consciousness that if Beijing sees Delhi as being or going out on a limb on issues like Tibet and Taiwan in ways that it does not like, that it too can put pressure on India's sovereignty issues or sovereignty concerns on places like Kashmir or places like India's northeast, which has had kind of insurgencies in the past. And China has done both these things, changed its position according to how it's feeling about India at the time. And so I think that has been how India has seen these sovereignty issues, and therefore it's resulted in a broad approach that's usually called for mutual sensitivity. And so India has been careful about how it has dealt with these issues. It has, the current foreign minister has talked of India and China needing to follow a three mutuals policy: mutual sensitivity, mutual interest, and mutual respect. Now this is the final point I'll make on this, which is this last respect part is where you've seen a little bit of a shift, which is there is a sense in India that China has not respected India's sensitivities on sovereignty issues and the border and others, on relations with Pakistan. And so what you've seen is an India that has become a little bit more or less cautious about commenting on these issues or the approach it's taken on Xinjiang, for example. Usually when the Indian Foreign Ministry is asked about the situation in Xinjiang, it'll usually punt. It has not punted recently. It has taken note of UN reports, talking about and quoted, quote unquote, the serious maltreatment of minorities. That's been one change. On Tibet, you've seen Prime Minister Modi going from not directly saying much to, publicly now wishing the Dalai Lama on his birthday every year and kind of other official engagements with other officials involved. And then you've seen, and we'll come back to this on Taiwan, India criticizing the militarization of the Taiwan Strait last year, which is also a change. And then, you do, but as we'll talk about, you do see kind of different levels of kind of how much India cares. So India has been less forward-leaning on Xinjiang, Hong Kong a little bit more because there's been a lot of economic engagement in citizens. And then I think, you've seen on Taiwan a little bit more in recent years. I think the issue that India cares more about, though, of all these issues is Tibet. And we'll come to that. But I want to actually ask you on the Tibet question, what has been the U.S. view and approach towards the issue of Tibet? Has this changed over time? Does the U.S., for example, have a view on the succession issue when it comes to the Dalai Lama?
Well, it's an important question and a question that deserves more attention, frankly. The short answer is that I think that U.S. views and prioritization on Tibet have shifted over time. If you think back, from George H.W. Bush administration to the end of the Obama administration, there was a pattern of the Dalai Lama meeting with the U.S. president every 2 years. And that was roughly consistent, and it was a ongoing rhythm that unfortunately broke during the Trump administration. It hasn't been picked up since. And while the Tibet issue is bigger than the Dalai Lama is a powerful symbol that has significant political salience in the United States. Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi and others are huge champions of the Dalai Lama and of Tibet issues more broadly. And his visits would have a galvanizing effect in terms of mobilizing interest and focusing attention on the issue of Tibet. Now, other Tibetan leaders still visit Washington regularly, and at technocratic levels, there are ongoing conversations about how the United States can best support Tibet and the Tibetan people. But it's just different when the leader, in this case the president, is not directly engaged. And so that's sort of where we are. I think that the overall policy posture of the United States towards Tibet has been broadly consistent, which is recognizing that Tibet is a part of China, but working very hard, to try to preserve Tibet's unique religious, cultural, and linguistic traditions. And I expect that will continue carrying forward. On the sensitive question of reincarnation, it is interesting. It is the only issue in the world I can think of where I've had a conversation in the Oval Office about the topic of reincarnation. But this is not an issue that should be decided by anyone outside of the Buddhist community and the Dalai Lama and his closest advisors. And so the Dalai Lama is, his life will end at some point, and this question will become very salient. I think that we, as a community, deserve to be having this conversation now so that we all have clarity on our respective views. And so it's not just a U.S. and China issue or an India and China issue, but an issue of global concern, because that is, I think, the magnitude of significance of it. But Tanvi, in your view, why has Tibet been of such sensitivity in the China-India relationship, and how is India thinking about this sensitive question of reincarnation?
It is kind of been a sensitive issue, I think, for India for three reasons. I think one, because more so than the other sovereignty issues we talked about, it directly implicates India's interests, particularly the question of the boundary dispute, with which it's intimately connected and has been. One of the things, if you go back to when the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, India had got its independence just a couple of years before that in 1947. At that point, India and China didn't actually have much of a border. Most of India's kind of border was with Tibet. And it had kind of special political, economic, religious, cultural links with Tibet. India had also inherited some rights from the British when it became independent. And indeed, kind of India's border claims were partly based on this tripartite Shimla Convention in the kind of 1910s that was agreed to. And so, it had these kind of links with Tibet as an entity. Now, with the Chinese takeover in Tibet in kind of that 1950-51 period, that changed. Tibet was no longer a buffer state. And when kind of, I think as part of that recognition, India, that China had essentially taken over and had control of Tibet, you see India and China then negotiate an agreement on Tibet, the preamble of which is now well known as the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, which are now probably remembered more in the breach than in the two, in them being followed. But nonetheless, what that agreement did is essentially de facto, with India recognizing Tibet as a region of China, it was called then. That was in 1954. Fast forward many decades, in 2003, India went further and recognized the Tibet Autonomous Region as a part of the territory of China. But in 54, what you did see is India essentially say, we don't think of Tibet as independent. We are now negotiating with China on the kind of issue of Tibet. It also meant India giving up a number of rights. And, the Nehru government at the time indicated that, look, this was going to buy peace. There's been subsequently a lot of criticism in India that, frankly, India should have gotten more out of that agreement, that China really wanted that agreement, that India could have negotiated at the very least a border settlement. Now, part of the reason that was not negotiated, and this was a wrong assumption on Nehru's part, is Nehru assumed the boundary was settled and was settled as part of the agreement because China didn't bring it up. China did not consider it settled. And this is, again, where Tibet comes in. India discovers that China doesn't consider it settled when they suddenly note that there's a road that China's built to consolidate its own control. And so you see these two countries kind of competing to consolidate controls in their peripheries, which is China builds a road between linking Tibet and Xinjiang. India says, wait, this is on territory we claim. And that's when you really see this kind of border issue come to the fore. And you see kind of this Tibet link also in India's east. So this is all in the western sector in what India calls Ladakh, areas China claims as Aksai Chin, all kind of on the Tibetan plateau. But even in the eastern sector, China claims a part of what territory India identifies as the state of Arunachal Pradesh. China calls it South Tibet, and particularly wants control of this place called Tawang, which is also a signifier that this is not just a geopolitical issue. It's a kind of quasi-ideological issue. Tawang being important because it is considered to be where the 6th Dalai Lama was born, and so important for Tibetan Buddhism. And the Indian analysts consider that one of the reasons China claims this is to try to exercise control not just over the succession of the Dalai Lama, but control over Tibetan Buddhism more broadly. 14th Dalai Lama, the current one, visits Tawang, his way of essentially endorsing India's claims to Arunachal Pradesh. And also, India facilitates that because it helps India's cause. I think so. That's one reason why you've seen, because Tibet is intimately linked with this boundary dispute and India's claims, it's sensitive, and it's sensitive for a second reason for India because there's a political dimension. This is an issue, Tibet, that the Indian public, both on the right and left, interestingly have cared about. Lots of criticism of the Nehru government for having given up on Tibet, let the Chinese take over Tibet. Now, that's another podcast perhaps on the feasibility of that. But nonetheless, the second reason I think it's treated with sensitivities, it is a political issue in India. And I think finally, this is where we come back to the US, which is that, one of the reasons India is careful about how it talks about Tibet, deals with Tibet, despite it being important for India's own boundary claims. On the other hand, they know it's important to China as well, and that China has had suspicions and accused India in the past, including in the run-up to the 1962 China-India war, of colluding with, either alone or in collusion with the US, essentially trying to undermine China's control and authority in Tibet. And so accusing, for example, in the 1950s, the US and India of essentially engineering or facilitating the escape of the Dalai Lama to India in 1959. And so to this day, that the presence of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan refugees in India is a sore subject with China. They're also kind of very disapproving of when India, allows U.S. officials to engage or U.S. officials to visit places like the Wang. You see this kind of. So you've seen, I think, this reason for the sensitivities. Despite that, I mean, I think one of the questions I've had, but has there been consultation and coordination on the subject of Tibet between the U.S. and India?
Yes, there has been, and I believe that it's appropriate. India hosts, the Tibetan government in exile, as well as the Dalai Lama. The United States has a significant interest in preserving and protecting Tibet's unique cultural and linguistic history. And so I think that there has been quiet consultations between the United States and India on how best to do so in a mutually supportive way toward a shared objective, but not in a way that is designed to be confrontational or adversarial towards China, but simply in a affirmative view of doing what is best to preserve and protect Tibet's unique cultural and linguistic traditions.
I mean, the only thing I'll say that on India is, there has been, at least in this effort, to be very cautious about any public consultation, which I think is fair because of those sensitivities I mentioned. Having said that, I think it is important also when the succession issue comes up. India is usually very careful, or at least the Indian government is very careful about what they say publicly. Essentially, the approach has been, when it has been talked about, usually by kind of unnamed sources, that it is for the Tibetans to choose. But this is something India cares about deeply, not least because it will have implications for China-India ties, but also potentially, the Dalai Lama has indicated that the next Dalai Lama would be born in a free country, and that could include India as well. So there will be these sensitivities. And I think one of the reasons I think consultations should take place is it is clear to me that China will name its own Dalai Lama. India has not backed kind of the Chinese stance that it will control the succession. I think that has also upset China, but nonetheless, there will be this issue of China perhaps not just naming a Dalai Lama, but also seeking to encourage other countries, particularly in the developing world or other countries that it has, to recognize the Dalai Lama name, and particularly any countries who have large Buddhist populations. And I think so it probably behooves India and the US and other like-minded partners to discuss how they will approach such issues, even if they're not doing it publicly. Ryan, I want to now move to kind of the other sensitive sovereignty issue that China brings up and is not least gets much more attention in the news for understandable reasons because of the stakes involved for the world, is Taiwan. One of the things I find is there's often a lot of confusion about what exactly is the U.S. stance, including in India, about Taiwan. So, Brian, you're the best person to ask. You've written a book with our colleague Richard Haas and our friend Bonnie Glaser from the German Marshall Fund recently on U.S.-Taiwan relations. So what is the U.S. stance on Taiwan?
Well, one of the best distillations of U.S. policy that I've seen, and I would refer people to look at if they're interested in digging deeper, is a background briefing call that a White House senior official provided ahead of Taiwan's January 13th election. And in that call, the senior official laid out in very sort of concrete ways what our policy is and what it is not. So that's a friendly advertisement for that background briefing call. But in short, the North Star of American policy is to preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, period. That is the basis upon which all decisions flow from and have for decades, and I expect will into the future as well. And part of the reason why I think there are so many questions about American policy is because, Americans are sort of a problem-solving people. We see a problem and we want to solve it. In this case, in the case of Taiwan, our strategy, our policy is not designed to solve cross-strait disputes. It is designed to keep a path open for leaders in Taipei and Beijing to find a resolution themselves. The United States does not support Taiwan independence, but also opposes any unilateral changes to the status quo by either side. We insist that any resolution of cross-strait differences be done peacefully, free from coercion, and in a way that respects the will of the people on Taiwan, who have a democratic ability to exercise their views and their voice. And so that is sort of the construct or the framework in which U.S. policy towards Taiwan operates, and I expect will into the future as well. But let me turn the question back to you, Tanvi. How is India approaching this question of Taiwan, and how have Indian views evolved in recent years, and how do you see them going forward?
I think approach it much less publicly than the U.S., obviously less directly involved. But one of the things that India took a very early decision on is in terms of recognizing, it was, I think, only the second or third country to recognize or shift its recognition from the Republic of China, led by Chiang Kai-shek, to the People's Republic in in the early 50s. And it was because India said, and in fact this came up in discussion when Prime Minister Nehru and President Truman first met, which is India's view was, look, they have control over the territory, and they have established that they hold authority in most of the country, and so we will recognize that government. And so you saw that decision made very early on. India also very early on and very consistently backed China, that is Beijing, taking the Chinese seat at the United Nations, which a decision still criticized by some in India. But after that, you saw kind of minimum official interaction. And that didn't mean, and almost till the 1990s. I think you didn't see, though, that India, even during this period, it wasn't like India didn't care about what happened in the Taiwan Strait. When I was writing my book on kind of U.S., India, China ties, one of the things I was actually surprised to learn is that India cared deeply about the Taiwan Strait crises in the 1950s. Because in the 1950s and 60s, while India's kind of mediation efforts or efforts to de-escalate or prevent escalation in the Korean War or in Southeast Asia, what was then called Indochina, are better known. It was also making efforts, diplomatic efforts, to de-escalate the situation, including passing on messages directly in meetings between Nehru and Mao Zedong or Nehru and President Eisenhower. And so you saw kind of India care deeply, and the position essentially is this was not other people's problem. Whatever happened in the Western Pacific would affect India. And so you didn't see official interaction. I think you start seeing this changing in the 1990s when India starts considering Taiwan as a prospective economic partner. You see the establishment of the India-Taipei Association, which is India's representative office. In 1995, eventually in 2003, you see a serving officer being appointed to head that as Director General, and you kind of see, but you see one other change, which is until this point, India had nothing called a one China, had never used the term one China policy. You see this really happening in the mid 1990s when India and China are trying to stabilize ties. And Jiang Zemin visits India, and that's the first reference you really see in an Indian document to not a one China principle as China lays out, but a one China policy. And it's repeated a few times, but you essentially see that end in kind of 2008-9. That was the last time you saw India mention it. It has refused to reiterate that. And the attitude, inadvertently, perhaps not in a planned way, the Indian foreign minister in 2014 essentially said, look, if China doesn't have a one India policy, then don't expect us to talk about a one China policy. And so I think that's where you've seen at least that issue stand. In the meantime, you have seen, I think one thing we've seen is economic, cultural ties, which always were kind of maintained, have increased. You see this in the trade and investment numbers. This is where kind of India-China tensions, because their border clash, have helped. Because as India, as well as other kind of like-minded partners, are trying to de-risk, India is trying to attract Taiwanese business into India. You see a company like Apple, whose Taiwanese subcontractors have now set up facilities. And as a result, you're also seeing not just those kind of economic, educational, think tank engagements increase. I think you're also starting to see some of the kind of quasi-official attention and engagement increase. So just a couple of things I'll mention. You started seeing, Indian ministers attend the inaugurations of, say, some of these Taiwanese subcontractors setting up. Taiwan has set up a third office of its economic and cultural center in India in Mumbai. They already have them in Delhi and Chennai. So while India, is still pretty cautious about what it says, you've seen it be more forward-leaning. You've seen the Indian government in kind of 2022 depart from its usual silence on what happens in the Taiwan Strait and call for restraint, call for the, as you said in the US case, call for no kind of unilateral changes to the status quo and the desire for peace and stability. And then, you see kind of those of us who watch these things very closely, there are kind of minor changes that seem minor, but are, I think, over time will show more of an impact. Indian diplomats used to go to do their Chinese language training in Beijing. They're now doing it in Taipei. You've seen kind of also the kind of officers that India is sending as Director General. They've not just served in China, they have often served in the US. As the current new Director General has also served in the Prime Minister's office as the previous one did. And so you're seeing kind of not very official. I don't think you'll see that change much. You've seen calls amongst the Indian public to do more, but largely you have seen a little bit more happening between India and Taiwan. I want to kind of again flip this around to how you see things. I mean, one of the things as we talk about engagement or with Taiwan broadly, but are there things that countries like India, in your perspective, can do before actually getting to a crisis point? So two aspects of the question. One, are there things that countries like India can do to kind of contribute to deterrence in kind of the region or engagement with Taiwan? So things to prevent a crisis taking place. And the second aspect of that I'll ask is, Well, if a crisis does take place, and I don't think we can't discuss that, what are the expectations from the U.S. or likely to be from the U.S. of countries like India and what they should be doing or could be doing if any one of the scenarios that people talk about materialize?
Well, thank you. Those are big questions. I will do my best to try to tackle them. On the first question, what can India be doing short of crisis? I think that, the way that I think about it at a conceptual level, China would like to isolate Taiwan as an issue and have it just be a narrow China and Taiwan issue for the two sides of the Taiwan Strait to resolve. That is their preference. And the more that India's leaders are able to communicate that, no, it is not just a narrow issue, it's an issue of global concern that directly implicates vital Indian interests, I think that that is a meaningful contribution. But not just narrowly in private diplomatic channels between New Delhi and Beijing, but also in ways that help the Indian public understand their stakes in the preservation of cross-strait peace and stability. Because the inescapable reality is that if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, every country will be impacted because the global economy will come to a grinding halt. Taiwan is the epicenter for production of semiconductor chips upon which the global economy runs. Over 50% of global commerce flows by Taiwan on a daily basis. And if there is instability in that part of the world, then every company, every country will be impacted for the worse. And the shock will be as large and most likely larger than was the case during COVID. So the stakes are enormous, and the more that there is public awareness of everyone's direct interest in the preservation of peace and stability, I think the better. The other thing that India could do short of conflict is help Taiwan be the best version of itself, which I think is in India's interest, it's in America's interest, to help Taiwan enjoy dignity and respect in the world stage, to help its economy remain vibrant, and to give it confidence in its own future. All these things I think are possible within the bounds of India's existing policy framework, and it would be wonderful to continue to make progress towards the direction of providing greater material and psychological support to the people of Taiwan. Now, in the event that there is a crisis, that's hard, but I think that the starting point for thinking through this is not to think of a cross-strait military conflict as dogfights above Taiwan and naval skirmishes in the Taiwan Strait. The reality is that if there was a conflict, it would be sprawling, global in scope, where each side would be seeking to exploit the other side's vulnerabilities, whether that's in space, in cyberspace, in access to fuel, or critical components for continued economic development. And I think that the United States would look to and hope for support from India in finding ways to limit China's warfighting capacity, to try to terminate the conflict as quickly and bloodlessly as possible. Now, there are ample ways in which India could contribute, short of direct military engagement in the conflict. The United States would want to be able to free up resources and capacity. And there are areas where I think that India could provide support for the United States to be able to do so. But those are just a few initial ideas to help us move forward in our thinking on this hard question. But how do you expect, Tanvi, that India would be impacted by any crisis in the Taiwan Strait?
So Ryan, I will ask you, what do you think is kind of the biggest myth or misunderstanding you hear surrounding these issues, whether about kind of the U.S. policy on Taiwan or Tibet?
The biggest myth or misunderstanding that immediately comes to mind for me, Tanvi, is in the U.S.-Taiwan context. And there is a myth or misunderstanding that the United States supports a particular political party in Taiwan, which is not the case. The United States was disciplined in its neutrality throughout the entire election process, which is a testament to the fact that the United States believes that the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is strongest when it is done on a bipartisan basis, both in the United States but also in Taiwan. And so that's one thing that I just wanted to draw out because I think it's important.
With that, thank you, Ryan, for joining us on the podcast. Hope to have you on a future season as well.
Thank you, Tanvi. It was wonderful to be with you.
Welcome to Global India. I'm Tanvi Madan, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution specializing in Indian foreign policy. On this new Brookings podcast, we'll be turning the spotlight